At its core, philosophy is about making sense of big questions through careful reasoning. To do that, we rely on arguments. And to be clear, the term argument in philosophy does not necessarily mean a fight or contentious exchange, as we often assume that it does. But rather, an argument is a set of statements where some statements provide support for another. It's like building a bridge. The supporting parts hold up the main idea. To begin with, let's start with the concept of a statement. A statement is a sentence that makes a claim about something. A statement can be true or false. For example, the sky is blue is a statement because it makes a claim about the world. If I were to say the sky is green, well, it's still a statement, even though it's an obviously false statement. Statements are the building blocks of arguments. In every argument, there is a conclusion, the main point or claim that the argument is trying to prove. Think of it as the destination that you're aiming for. The reasons or evidence that support the conclusion are called premises. These are the starting points that lead you to your conclusion. So typically an argument looks something like this. We have a conclusion, our main point, and then one or more premises supporting that conclusion. An example might look something like this. Here's a simple argument. All cats sleep. Opal is a cat. Therefore, Opal sleeps. So here, the premises work together to justify the conclusion. And we can see this as we break down the argument into its basic components. So premise 1, all cats sleep. Premise 2, Opal is a cat. Conclusion, therefore, Opal sleeps. So we see here a conclusion, Opal sleeps, supported by two premises. All cats sleep, and Opal is a cat. Not every group of sentences is an argument. Sometimes people just state opinions without support. But in philosophy, we focus on arguments that are structured and logical. We're less interested in opinion and highly interested in well-structured arguments. For example, if I were to say, the mayor is doing a poor job. Well, this is a statement, but not an argument. Why? Well, there's no support for this conclusion. In other words, there are no premises. It's therefore simply an opinion or maybe a slogan. So this is a common example. We see this a lot in politics. Opinions or slogans are offered without any supporting premises. When Barack Obama was running for president, he had the famous slogan, hope and change. Donald Trump used the famous slogan, make America great again. These are slogans, not political arguments. And that's okay. Not everything needs to be an argument. Slogans can actually be very useful rhetorical shortcuts to help motivate or excite people. Likewise, simply saying the mayor is doing a poor job is something like a slogan or at best, an opinion. It's not an argument because there are no premises to back up the conclusion. The point is, this is often where we stop. We might be sitting around at a barbecue and someone simply says, the mayor is doing a poor job. And the people there will either agree or disagree. But seldom do we press one another beyond our opinion or beyond the slogan that's being used. If we agree, we generally don't challenge the opinion. If we disagree, we often just shrug our shoulders and say something like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, or that guy's just an idiot. We seldom challenge opinions or slogans, especially when they're politically charged like this one. But if I were to say something like, well, what specifically don't you like about the job the mayor is doing? This is something similar to what we might see Socrates doing. And you'll recall from the last chapter that Socrates was not quick to offer his point of view. Rather, he would ask a series of questions that place the burden off of Socrates and onto his interlocutor. Most of the time, we're tempted to jump right in with some type of counter-argument. But a good philosopher will exercise patience. Remember, our goal in philosophy is not to destroy our interlocutor. Rather, our aim is to increase in wisdom. Now, with that said, a good philosopher should be able to dominate the average debate. The skills to do so must be there. But that's not our goal. We're seeking truth and wisdom. And if we're not careful, debates can get nasty and produce anything but truth and wisdom, especially in politics. Now, in response, if we were to say, taxes have increased and services have declined. Little has been done about the financial corruption. Therefore, I think the mayor is doing a poor job. We have now moved from a slogan or an opinion to an actual argument. We have a conclusion supported by two premises. Furthermore, we now have an understanding of what our interlocutor is thinking. In other words, we have increased in wisdom and understanding, and that is the goal. Despite how hard it is to digest, our goal is not to body slam our opponent. It's not necessarily even to win. As philosophers, we're seeking wisdom and understanding. In this case, we may not like what we're hearing, especially if I'm a supporter of the mayor, but I now have an understanding of where person A stands. So now that we have a basic outline of an argument, the natural question might be, what makes a good argument? For an argument to be considered good, it must meet two key conditions. First, the premises must be true, or at least believable based on what we know. If the premises are false, well, the whole argument falls apart like a house built on sand. Second, the premises must logically support the conclusion. This means that the conclusion should follow naturally from the premises, without any gaps in reasoning. If both conditions are met, the argument is solid and persuasive. So these two conditions help us separate good arguments from bad ones. We'll see how they apply as we look at different types of arguments. Arguments come in different forms, but two main types stand out: deductive and inductive. So the first uncomfortable thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to memorize the difference between these two types of arguments. When you turn on CNN or Fox News or listen to your favorite podcast, you should quickly be able to determine if you're hearing a deductive or an inductive argument type. So let's define both argument types. A deductive argument is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It's airtight. There's no room for doubt. For example, if it rains, the ground gets wet. It's raining, therefore, the ground is wet. Deductive arguments aim for certainty. So to evaluate this argument, let's break it down into its components. Premise 1, if it rains, the ground gets wet. Premise 2, it's raining. Conclusion, therefore, the ground is wet. So here we have the argument broken down into its components. And step 1 in becoming skilled at the philosophical argument is to develop the ability to break down an argument into its components. This is a simple argument and not too hard to do, but generally arguments are more complex. People are saying them at a rather fast pace, and it can be hard to do this. So for beginning philosophers, we might have to write it all down and sort it out manually like we're doing here. An advanced philosopher can hear these components naturally and do this in their head at a pace close to or in real time. So in examining an argument, we evaluate each premise one at a time. In this case, we can conclude that each premise is true based on our current understanding of how the weather works. So next we determine whether or not premises logically support the conclusion. In this argument, we can see that each premise does indeed logically support the conclusion. We evaluate deductive arguments such as the one above using terms like valid and sound. A valid argument has a structure where the conclusion logically follows from the premises. In the example above, we can see that the conclusion logically follows from the premises, making it a valid argument. A sound argument is valid and has true premises. Sound arguments are the gold standard in deduction because they guarantee a true conclusion. So here we see that our argument is both valid and sound. And this is what we're aiming for when we create a deductive argument. Note, however, that an argument can still be considered valid even if the premises are not true. For instance, all cats can fly. Gigi is a cat. Therefore, Gigi can fly. Well, this is valid in structure, but the premises are false. So looking closely at this particular argument, we can see that it's logically structured, meaning the conclusion is logically supported by the premises. It's therefore a valid argument, and yet this argument may not be sitting well with the reader. Why? Well, perhaps it's because at least one premise is false. We can, of course, point to premise 1, all cats can fly, and recognize that this is not true. So what then are we to do with an argument like this one? Well, in philosophy, we recognize arguments like this as valid, but not sound. So it's valid because it follows the deductive format of a philosophical argument, with premises logically supporting the conclusion. However, it is not sound, because at least one of the premises are false. So let's pause for a moment and make sure we're getting this. So really quickly, what is a valid argument? A valid argument is a deductive argument with premises logically supporting the conclusion. What is a sound argument? A sound argument is a deductive argument with true premises. So if I were to change premise 1 here, we now have a valid and a sound argument. So once again, a sound argument is valid and has true premises. Sound arguments are the gold standard in deduction because they guarantee a true conclusion. Now, on the other hand, an inductive argument uses premises to make a conclusion that is probable, but not certain. It generalizes from specific examples. So consider the following. 90% of students at this college believe in the existence of God. Sophia is a student at this college. Therefore, Sophia likely believes in the existence of God. So when we look at this argument on paper, it's easy to spot a key limitation of inductive arguments. The conclusion is based on limited personal experience, which might not cover everything. In this case, the only way to be certain is to interview every single student at the college. So in instances where this is not possible, we rely on inductive arguments. Now, inductive arguments are judged as strong or weak. A strong inductive argument has premises that make the conclusion very likely. A weak one doesn't provide enough support. The conclusion feels like a stretch. So if a strong inductive argument also has true premises, it's called cogent. Cogent arguments are reliable for making educated guesses about the world. There's also a special kind of inductive reasoning called inference to the best explanation. So this is when you choose the explanation that best fits the facts. For example, if your car won't start and you remember leaving the lights on, the best explanation might be a dead battery. We evaluate these by how well they explain the evidence, how simple they are, and how they fit with what we already know. Stronger inferences cover more facts without unnecessary complications. So we've seen how inductive arguments move from specific observations two broader conclusions. And these conclusions are probable, but never absolutely certain. Now, this might sound like a weakness at first, but it's actually a strength in one of the most important human endeavors, science. Inductive reasoning is largely how we do science. So think about the scientific method, the step-by-step process scientists use to understand the world. And it typically looks something like this. 1, I make observations about the world. 2, form a hypothesis, a tentative explanation or prediction. 3, test the hypothesis through experiments or further observations. And 4, analyze the results and draw conclusions. And number 5, if the results support the hypothesis, it gains strength. If not, revise or reject it. So notice that every step relies on induction. Scientists observe specific events like apples falling from trees or planets moving in certain paths, and then generalize to broader laws, such as the law of gravity. Now, philosophers often use specific patterns in their arguments, and learning these helps you to spot them quickly. Let's look at a few deductive forms using the common if-then pattern. Modus ponens is a valid form if P then Q. P is true, therefore Q. So let's look at an example. If you study, you'll pass the test. You studied, therefore you'll pass. So let's examine this argument a little more closely. If you study, P, then you'll pass the test, Q. P, you studied. Q, you'll pass. So here we see the classic if-then pattern in action. When we see a premise containing the terms if and then, or synonyms, we recognize the premise as being a conditional premise, meaning there are conditions associated with it. In such arguments, the if-then components are known respectively as the antecedent and the consequent. In this particular modus ponens argument, if you study P, you'll pass the test Q. You studied, therefore you'll pass. So we first recognize the conditional nature of the if-then statement. Q cannot occur unless P occurs. In other words, I can only pass the test, Q, if I study, P. Furthermore, the if statement is identified as the antecedent, while the then statement is known as the consequent. So mastering these two terms helps you break down arguments, identify their structure, and catch mistakes in reasoning, skills that are essential in philosophy and everyday critical thinking. So now that you have these key terms in mind, we can state that another name for modus ponens argumentation is affirming the antecedent. To affirm the antecedent means to assert that the if part or the antecedent of a conditional statement is true. Affirming the antecedent happens when you say P is true. Modus tollens is another valid argumentation form. If P, then Q. Q is false. Therefore, P is false. Because the if condition is not met in the above example, the then condition cannot be satisfied. Because the streets are not dry, not P, we must conclude that it's not raining, not Q. As with the modus ponens argument form, the modus tollens uses the same components. What is different, however, is that in a modus tollens argument, such as the one above, we are denying the consequent. To deny the consequent means to assert that the consequent is false. In other words, we are invoking not Q, because we can observe that the streets are dry. The next topic I want to briefly cover is the idea of logical fallacies. Understanding what logical fallacies are, how to spot them, can help with our philosophical literacy. It can also help give you an upper hand in the workplace, as well as in personal relationships. You've encountered logical fallacies many times before, but let's focus on just a few in this discussion.
As you dive into arguments, whether in academic settings, professional environments, political discourse, or personal relationships, watch for logical fallacies, errors in reasoning that make arguments weak, misleading, or entirely invalid. Understanding what logical fallacies are and how to spot them can give you a significant advantage in evaluating claims, making decisions, and constructing your own arguments. Mastering this skill transforms you from a passive recipient of information into an active, critical thinker who can navigate complex discussions with confidence and clarity. Logical fallacies are persuasive techniques that appear reasonable on the surface but contain fundamental flaws in their reasoning. They can be used intentionally to manipulate audiences or can arise unintentionally from sloppy thinking. Either way, they undermine productive discourse and can lead to poor decisions. By learning to recognize these patterns, you develop what philosophers call epistemic hygiene, the practice of keeping your beliefs and reasoning processes clean and well maintained. The straw man fallacy, attacking what was never said. How it works. Person A presents a nuanced argument. Person B restates it in an extreme or distorted form. Person B attacks this distorted version. Person B claims to have refuted Person A's actual position. For example, one politician proposes reducing military spending by 10% to fund infrastructure. Another politician responds, "My opponent wants to completely dismantle our military and leave us defenseless." The original proposal was modest, but politician number 2 creates an extreme version to frighten voters. The bandwagon fallacy. Popularity doesn't equal truth. The bandwagon fallacy, also known as argumentum ad populum, appeal to the people, argues that because many people believe or do something, it must be correct, desirable, or true. The underlying assumption is that majority opinion validates a claim, but history is filled with examples of popular beliefs that were demonstrably wrong, from the geocentric model of the universe to the acceptance of slavery to the belief that smoking was harmless. The structure: everyone believes, does X. Therefore, X must be true, good, right. Consumer example: this is the best-selling smartphone, so it must be the best phone. But sales figures reflect marketing budgets, brand loyalty, carrier deals, and timing, not necessarily superior quality. A less popular phone might better suit your needs. Workplace example: everyone else works unpaid overtime, so you should too. Widespread practice doesn't make something ethical or legally required. Just because others accept poor treatment doesn't mean you must. The bandwagon fallacy exploits our social instincts, our desire to belong, to be accepted, to avoid standing out. Advertisers weaponize this constantly, join millions of satisfied customers. But truth is not democratic. Reality doesn't yield to majority vote. Critical thinking requires examining evidence independently, even when, especially when, it contradicts popular opinion. The ad hominem fallacy, targeting the person, not the argument. The ad hominem fallacy, Latin for to the person, targets the character, motives, or circumstances of the person making an argument, rather than addressing the argument's substance. It's a diversionary tactic that shifts focus from what is being said to who is saying it. While a person's credibility can sometimes be legitimately relevant, ad hominem arguments typically serve to poison the well and avoid engaging with challenging ideas. Common forms: direct personal insult. You're just a liar, idiot, elitist, so your argument is worthless. Circumstantial ad hominem. Of course you support that policy. You'd profit from it. Guilt by association. Your idea is similar to something an evil person once said, so it must be wrong. Examples: political debate. During political debates, candidates often resort to personal insults. questioning intelligence, honesty, or mental fitness, rather than substantively addressing policy differences. We might cheer when our favoured candidate lands an insult, but this doesn't advance our understanding of complex policy questions. It merely entertains and polarises. Workplace scenario. During a meeting, an employee suggests a new workflow process. A colleague responds, "That idea comes from someone who's only been here 6 months. What could you possibly know about how we do things?" The colleague attacks the person's tenure rather than evaluating whether the proposed process has merit. Ad hominem fallacies are sometimes considered emotionally satisfying but intellectually lazy. They provide the illusion of winning an argument without doing the hard work of engaging with ideas. In toxic political and social media environments, they've become normalized, even celebrated. Resist this temptation. Address arguments on their merits. When you encounter ad hominem arguments directed at you, calmly redirect to the substance. Rather than discussing my character, let's focus on the evidence I've presented. The appeal to authority when expertise isn't enough. The appeal to authority fallacy occurs when someone claims an argument is correct simply because an authority figure or expert says so, without providing underlying evidence or reasoning. This is fallacious when 1. The authority isn't actually expert in the relevant field. 2. Experts in the field disagree. 3. The authority is biased. Or 4. The appeal replaces evidence rather than supporting it. Important distinction. Not all references to authority are fallacious. Citing expert consensus supported by evidence is reasonable. The fallacy occurs when authority replaces evidence or when the authority is inappropriately applied. Red flags. The authority figure is famous but not expert in the relevant domain. No evidence is provided beyond "the expert says so." The authority has financial or ideological incentives to take a position. The claim contradicts scientific consensus or expert majority examples. The key principle: consult experts, but don't outsource your thinking entirely. Ask for their reasoning and evidence. Check whether other experts agree. Consider their potential biases. Expertise is valuable, but it should inform your judgment, not replace it. The false dilemma. When life isn't binary. The false dilemma fallacy, also called false dichotomy or black and white thinking, occurs when someone presents only 2 options as if they're the only possibilities, when in fact more alternatives exist. This artificially constrains the debate and forces people into unnecessary either-or choices. It's particularly insidious because binary thinking feels clear and decisive, but reality is usually more nuanced. The pattern: either you support position A or position B. There is no middle ground. Choose a side. But in reality, positions C, D, E, and F also exist and may be superior examples. Political rhetoric: you're either with us or against us. This phrase, famously used in post-9/11 discourse, eliminates space for nuanced positions, conditional support, loyal opposition, or constructive criticism. It treats disagreement as betrayal. Workplace scenario. During a meeting, someone says, "If you don't like my proposal, you clearly don't want to solve this problem." But rejecting one solution doesn't mean rejecting the goal. There could be 5 better alternatives. Perhaps the proposal is too expensive, too risky, or addresses symptoms rather than root causes. Relationship conflict. Either you trust me completely or you don't trust me at all. But trust isn't binary. It exists on a spectrum and varies by context. You might trust your partner with emotional support, but have reasonable concerns about their financial management skills. False dilemmas shut down creative problem solving. When someone presents you with an either-or choice, pause and ask, what other options exist? Can we combine elements of different approaches? Is there a compromise position? Life is rarely black and white. Most important decisions involve navigating shades of grey. Tu quoque fallacy, the the you too deflection. The tu quoque fallacy, Latin for you too or you also, deflects criticism by pointing out that the critic engages in the same behavior they're criticizing. Rather than addressing whether the criticism is valid, it attacks the critic's consistency or hypocrisy. While hypocrisy might be worth noting, it doesn't actually refute the original point. A hypocrite can still be correct. The pattern. Person A criticizes person B for behavior X. Person B responds, "But you do X too." The original criticism remains unaddressed. Examples: marital conflict. Person A says, "I wish you'd show me more respect when we disagree in front of the kids." Person B replies, "Well, you disrespect me all the time." This deflection accomplishes nothing. Person A's concern remains valid, regardless of whether they're also sometimes disrespectful. The response escalates conflict and avoids the actual issue. A productive reply would address the specific concern. Political discourse. When one political party criticizes another for deficit spending, the accused party responds, "But you ran up deficits when you were in power." While this points out inconsistency, it doesn't address whether the current deficit spending is justified or problematic. Tu quoque is emotionally satisfying because it feels like turning the tables, but it's intellectually hollow. It's particularly destructive in personal relationships, where it creates an endless cycle of counter-accusations without resolution. When you're tempted to use "but you do it too," stop and ask whether the criticism has merit. If it does, acknowledge it and work on improvement. If it doesn't, explain why. Don't just deflect. Appeal to hypocrisy, when actions don't invalidate arguments. The appeal to hypocrisy dismisses an argument by pointing out that the person making it doesn't live up to their own standards. While related to tu quoque, this fallacy specifically focuses on inconsistency between someone's words and actions. The underlying assumption is that only people who perfectly embody their positions have the right to advocate for them, but this would make moral and practical improvement impossible. The structure. Person A advocates for principle X. Person B points out that Person A violates principle X. Person B concludes Person A's argument is therefore invalid. Examples: parenting. Person A, parent says, "Kids, you shouldn't be lazy and waste your whole day on screens." Person B, child, replies, "But you're lazy too. You spend hours watching TV." Even if the parent is being hypocritical, the argument about screen time's effects on children remains valid or invalid on its own merits. The parent's failure to model good behaviour is a separate issue from whether the advice is sound. Workplace ethics. A manager discusses the importance of punctuality but is frequently late themselves. An employee thinks, "Why should I be on time when the boss isn't?" While the manager should model better behaviour, punctuality might still be important for team coordination, customer service, or productivity. The appeal to hypocrisy is seductive because it feels like catching someone in a gotcha moment. But consider, if only people who perfectly lived their values could advocate for them, no one could argue for any improvement. The recovering alcoholic couldn't advocate for addiction treatment. The formerly poor person who achieved wealth couldn't speak about economic mobility. The person struggling with anger management couldn't recommend therapy. We'd have no capacity for moral growth or learning from mistakes. Evaluate arguments on their logic and evidence, not on the speaker's personal consistency. Logical fallacies pervade modern discourse. You'll find them in presidential debates, social media arguments, workplace meetings, advertising campaigns, news commentary, family discussions, and personal relationships. Once you learn to spot them, you'll be amazed and perhaps dismayed by how prevalent they are.
Again, these are all examples of logical fallacies. So look for this type of language in the media, the workplace, politics. Learn to recognize it in your own personal relationships. Learn to catch it. Learn to call it out. And more importantly, avoid it. This capability will give you a tremendous edge in life. Take care and keep asking why.